Welcome to another design video. Have you ever, when playing a horror game especially, felt this sense of unease and dread as you were playing something? You're like shoving shivers going down your spine as you were playing. What is just a game? I mean, you're seeing something on a screen and yet you're sort of reacting in a way as if you were there. Hopefully you've had the experience where, less and more, it depends on the person, how much you experience this, but hopefully you have. And if you have experienced something we call presence. And that's what I want to be talking about today, what it's about and how we can utilize it in a game. So, as a starting point, when we think of ourselves as our bodies and our perception of ourselves, we tend to think about as we have a map or that we're seeing. You look down on yourself and you think, well, this is really me. You're thinking about your POV, that is, that you're seeing everything from your eyes. That you take that for granted. That's how it is. You're seeing reality as it is. This is not the case. Instead, what is the real case is that the brain, the stuff in your skull, gets a bunch of signals from outside called as data, and that helps form the self-image. And that's really what we experience when you're experiencing being yourself, being present in a physical form. That's what is sort of happening. But what it feels like is as if we have this magical eye inside of our heads, which is the pure viewer of things that happen. And that this field of view here, this sort of perspective where things came into, is the sort of natural only way we can see things. But what really is happening is that these green balls here represent data from the outside. These enter through the eyes or any sensory organ for that matter. We have more senses than the usual 5, but you have like the sense of where your body is at any time, balance and so on. All of those senses collect data, which helps then us form where you are, the sense of where you as the experiencer of an experience is currently at. It's a bit weird thinking about it like that, but that's really how it is. So as an example, you have some data, like things that appear before you. Like you can take this, like look around, take any object, anything, your own body, things that it interacts with, whatever, and take that as the data. And then what happens is that this data gets into the brain and it gets processed. And normally, I'm guessing most of you watching this video, all I'd say, but you never know, are going to feel that is if there is a face, head behind your eyes, you sort of assume that, again, that's the data, is part of the data, and that you have a field of view that sort of views this data like this. But that doesn't have to be the case. You could potentially think of scenarios where the brain chooses to interpret the data of these points as from a totally different perspective, like below. And the face, which is not visible, not part of the data set, it just, we remove this. We don't care about this. That's a potential thing that happens. And you might go like, wait a second. What are you saying? Does people really feel this? And yes, there are. People have supported this. We call them out-of-body experiences. And you can get this through drugs, or I think you gotten it through having a magnetic field through the head and so on, or just through, anything, meditation, whatnot. And you get this sense of that you're floating outside of your body and seeing yourself from afar. It's not normal, but it happens. And what happens then is that you get this data of yourself in bed, in this case. It goes into the head, and then for some reason, the brain interprets this as you floating up outside of your own body and looking down on yourself. And that's something that happens. And another like less or more normal thing that happens as well, which is a good example, is that you see something in the outside world. A tree, for instance, when that tree enters your eye and sort of hits your retina here, this sort of photon light collecting apparatus inside your eye, that image gets turned. So it gets sent to the brain upside down. And in textbooks and so on, I remember reading this in school, they say, well, the brain flips it around. But that's not really what happens, right? There's no process in the brain that sort of goes, oop, right side you go. Really, you just really have the brain instead conceptualize that up is this direction. So you just interpret the data as such. If we go back and think about it, it's similar to here. The brain just interprets where it's at and how it's going to interpret, like how you're going to think about what you're seeing. And you're not, again, I don't want to get into this too deep, but you're not seeing a video feed. We tend to think about as there is a camera and that whatever we're seeing is this feed, but it's all data that gets interpreted. That's a rabbit hole. Perhaps I'll make a video about that another time, but that's sort of a bit far apart. Just it's important that you think about our experience as data. So a good example of how this sort of upside down actually works is an experiment that was did with these sort of upside down goggles. So what happens in these goggles is that they take the outside world, they flip it so that before it reaches the eye, it's already upside down. So it sort of feels obvious, right, that the participant of an experiment like this will see it upside down. And that's exactly what happens. You ask them on day one, is the world upside down? Which is sort of like obvious question, right? It feels obvious they're going to say, yes, the world is upside down. But something weird happens after a few days of wearing these things. It would be interesting doing this. I'm wondering how you would feel like this, seeing the world upside down. But after a few days, you ask them, is the world upside down? And they go, I don't know. That's weird. Like that has to make you pause. Something like that. Like how data that comes into you, like vision that's obviously upside down, after a bit, people go, I don't know. And this is not like the brain flipping it. It's just you getting used to that data flow and turning yourself around. And that turning yourself around is just a sort of a lesser version of this sort of outer body experience. Not as extreme. So that's sort of good to know. Have that in mind as we go forward. And now let's just review what happens. So again, you have data coming in. The data gets processed by the brain, and we end up with an experience. Okay, so far so good. Now let's take another example, a favorite of mine, which is the rubber hand experiment. Okay, it goes something like this. You have a subject, which can be you. Think about it as you, perhaps, if you want to partake in this. And you have a field of view that is like this. You put up some shield here to block off your real hand, which you put on a table. And then you have a rubber hand sitting here in front of you. Okay, so what you see, if you look down, you're going to see in front of you not your real hand, but a rubber hand. And your real hand is on the table, but you have a screen, which is this one, that sort of shields you. You can't see your real hand. Okay. Simple enough. So what happens now is that you take some stick or something, and you poke or caress the rubber hand and the real hand at the same point at the same time. So you get the sort of like a sensation of being touched. However, you're not seeing your real hand. You're only seeing the rubber hand. So what's happening now in the brain, we talked about the reform cells. So I know my face is here, and now in what happening is that the brain, because of this feedback of seeing the rubber hand being stroked and sensing the hand being stroked, you start getting a different image. You're gonna start feeling as if this rubber hand actually belongs to you. It becomes part of your self-image, which is weird, right? But again, think about the data stream coming in. And we can test that this is actually something that happens. So if you take a hammer and go like, bam, slam on the rubber hand, the subject that's experimented on is gonna retract the real hand. Like trying to move the rubber hand out of the way by moving the real hand, which has two interesting aspects. One, they think they can move the rubber hand. Like, you actually get into the mindset of thinking the rubber hand belongs to you and that you can actually move it around with your thought, which should give you pause that that's something that happens that's easily. Also, they're afraid of being hurt as the rubber hand gets hit because their sensation is like, this is mine. And it gets even trickier because you can even threaten it. You can put a knife. These are really weird experiments, right? Which is why I love them. You put a knife next to the rubber hand and sort of like go, I'm gonna stab you or I'm gonna cut you. And the person being experimented goes like, they start sweating. You can measure what you call the galvanic skin response in them, basically palm sweat. And they're gonna be sweating, they're gonna be afraid. So you get a fear response out of threatening something that's a rubber hand. Who cares, right? If you were seeing the rubber hand somewhere else, you wouldn't care. But in this particular instance, once you got that feedback loop and incorporated it into your sense of self, suddenly you think of it as your own. So again, what's happening? Data comes in, processed, and we got a self-image. So there's been research done in this. So there's this Swedish scientist, along with others, Henrik Eriksson, and been doing this experiment for a while. And here is one where instead of caressing a finger, poking at the chest obviously here, but also then poking in thin air, and they have a helmet on, so their field of view is something like that. And now the experimenters are gonna they're gonna have an out-of-body experience. They're gonna see themselves and they think of themselves as being here. They're changing their perception due to this feedback loop. And you can do this sort of similar experiments like here and threaten and pull a hammer, and they're gonna have similar reactions. So what's happening is that there is what I'm calling a feedback loop. The expression here is not 100% feedback loop, but hopefully you'll excuse me. But it's still like feedback loop in the sense that it is, there's multiple effects, the seeing and feeling that work together in order to increase some sort of sensation. In that sense, it's a feedback loop. So what we have here is that feedback loop goes on and it changes how the subject perceives themselves. So now they're having an out-of-body experience. They're seeing the viewer being behind them. Also worth knowing, just because I said it before, that like here we have an explicit change in vision. But I mean, in theory, you could have this sense of seeing yourself from behind actually happening without the VR helmet. Then you probably need drugs or something like it. But I mean, it's conceptually possible. Also very important to note that. So again, finally, you have this sort of feedback loop. Touch, sensations, sensing something, and seeing something. And it sort of goes round, and it increases the sense of being somewhere else. And it's also important here that it's happening continuously, because it's going to wear off. It's not like you poke once and then all of a sudden we're going to get to players in a bit, the subject continues to experience. You have to do this all along, and because your brain is constantly monitoring these things. So it sort of constantly watching out and making theories about what the reality out there, what yourself is, and so on. And you have to have a continuous process going on, a continuous feedback loop. Okay, so what does this mean for games? How do we make this into some sort of games? Okay, so let's think about what sort of feedback loops of this kind we have in games. Take something simple like Monkey Island. So I click and Guybrush sort of moves around. This doesn't really change my sense of presence. I mean, I'm not feeling I am in Monkey Island. Perhaps some people do. I think it's rare. In a more like extreme form, more like really feeling present in there. You can still feel atmospheric. You can feel part of the storyline, and you don't really feel present because there's nothing really happening. There's a big difference, and we can see this in early games. So take the original Myst. So in Myst, you click, and as we click, we change the POV. So if I click here, I'm gonna get to a position further down the path. This brings a much bigger sense of presence. And you can see interesting things happening in the player base from something like Myst. What you get is, that didn't exist before, is explorers. So people that simply want to exist in the game world. So they don't want to puzzle, they just want to walk around. And tourist, I think the phrase was used as we were doing the games. So and this was a key element of the success of the game, this sense of being present in Myst. And then we get further down the line. So mention that this is very discrete. It happens in step, but it still conjures up a bit of presence, especially if you click around a lot. And also worth knowing here is that you have to you also have to think about your environment in many ways. I'll get back to that in a bit, but a key part of Myst is not only this loop, but also that players need to think how are these located next to one another. You give a reason for a reward in terms of solving puzzles for actually understanding this. So let's further down the line now, and here this is supposed to be a control stick. By pushing a control stick, which is an analog movement, that has, in this case, our protagonist moving in Silent Hill, and this is an analog movement. So we got a much stronger sense of presence here. Now we really feel like we're in the game. And here also that worth knowing that the idea of pushing a stick sort of dissolves over time, because you are not, as a player, you're not thinking about pushing a stick. You're thinking actually about, I just want to go forward. That's what you're thinking, and you're sort of your thumb, or usually thumb, I guess, moves the stick. And that's sort of almost an unconscious action at a certain point. So you're thinking forward and you're moving forward, which is the sort of thing where you start connecting then a thought to something happening on screen. So I think something happens. So again, we start feeling much more part of the protagonist than what we did in something like Myst, because our thought process gets interlinked with what's happening on screen. So further down the line, even so, from game I worked on myself, which is Dark Descent. And in Dark Descent, and this was interesting also because a lot of people thought, why have all these physics interactions like opening door analog? Like, doesn't make any sense, but it makes perfect sense. There's other reasons too, but for presence wise, because you get more stuff, you can interact with the environment by doing these analog actions. And again, that sort of the idea of doing an interaction on your input sort of dissolves, and it's more like I think something and actions take place. So you get more opportunities to have this feedback loop that makes you present in the game, which I think honestly is a very important point in making the game scary and having emotional reactions from the player, that they actually start feeling present in the game. And another interesting side point is that there's been research on this where players that are better at playing games, like used to first-person controls and so on, feel more scared. Why? Because they don't think about controls anymore. They're thinking about actions. So again, you get a stronger feedback loop going on. And of thinking and seeing actions happening. And that's stronger sense of presence. Another thing I want to mention as well is haptics, so rumble on the joypad, which is another thing because something happens. Here's a happening on the screen, whatever that is. The joystick rumbles, and you're like, oh, you feel more present. And that could be like taking a hit or something like that. All of a sudden, oh, I'm taking a hit. I'm feeling something. The character reacts. I'm reacting. Ooh, I'm in there. A recent example for me personally is Half-Life Alyx. So Half-Life Alyx has these healing stations where you, in the game, put your hand, and they have some very crude haptics as these nails start going on your fingers, but my hand feels much more in the game as that happens. And I wish, like, you should have, it would be interesting in actually making a game having this as a core concept of constantly trying to increase the sense of presence by doing these sort of feeling thingies, like we saw in the experiments with the rubber hand, or the ones where they're poking at the chest and getting out of body experiences. Another thing of note is that if you've seen the video on mental models, which if you haven't, I'll link to it below in the description, and you should see it. It's very connected, and presence is really a sort of subset of the mental model. So mental model is whatever the brain takes input in, makes its model of the world, and presence is a big part of that. But it's kind of special, and it's different from what I talked before, because it's subjectively very different, because you're actually transporting yourself into a new environment. So what's happening overall here in a game is that, so the player provides input, they get output, the data. This is data coming here into your skull, and all of this then makes this into a feedback loop, as I talked about. And that means that the player's sense of self is going to change, so that you have an object here, some data, like you look at something in the game, you walk towards something in the game, a data object, and all of a sudden you start thinking about your POV not in the strongest sense that you're actually seeing it from the point of view of the character, unless it's a first-person game where you actually sort of do, but in third person not so much. But still, like, you start experiencing things from their point of view of the character. You're not seeing it as you're not thinking I'm looking at a computer screen or a TV screen. You know, I'm looking through the eyes of a character. I'm following. I am a character. Now, the problem is that our brains are lazy. So inside your skull is a lazy bastard, and this brain has very simplistically has like some mental energy or whatever. There's a certain amount of available focus to do something, yeah, and keeping your mindset on, like, thinking as if you were the character is takes up a lot of energy, and the brain sort of doesn't really want to, so they want to, like, you know, reduce the amount of energy used in order to do this, and that sort of becomes much easier if you're just thinking of yourself as looking at a screen instead of being inside the screen. So it's less computationally less expensive, and then so that's something to think about, and you always have to have this in mind. And one thing that actually helps a lot is to do this in a horror setting, because once the player gets afraid, the brain sort of, you know, there's various chemicals and so on that comes into play that puts you in this sort of a fight or flight response, and that sort of summons all sort of resources, which makes it easier to keep this mindset. It's sort of almost forces you into that mindset. Almost it focuses the experience. It forces the player into that. So horror is sort of like an easy way of getting there. It's not the only way of getting there, obviously, but it's part of it. But then horror can also have the opposite effects. Is just if you're dying a lot and so on, then the players like start figuring out the system and they optimize away and so on. So all of this is very interconnected with the mental model and so on and so forth. And in an upcoming video, I have to go into more tricks and tips in order to like keep the presence really strong. But this video is already quite long, so I'm gonna wrap it up there. But hopefully it gives you some insight into it all. And what I want you to really have a takeaway is how weird this is. Like this, you shouldn't take this for granted that this is actually like is possible. And you should really, when you're really into a game or see a player being really into the games, like someone who has a very averse reaction to playing a horror game like screams and so on, why are they doing that? And think how fantastic it is that they have now transported themselves into a virtual realm. That's very, very interesting, that actually occurs. And that's it. Hopefully it was useful. See you next time.